Today we're going to talk about Gettysburg. Oftentimes it has been called the Battle of Gettysburg was the high tide of the Confederacy. They penetrated deeper into the North than they ever had before. When that battle started, they had not, General Lee had not lost a battle to the North, and General Lee was feeling pretty cocky. He was thinking that this could be the knockout blow to the North. So that's why we're going to be looking at it, and that's why it's oftentimes called the high tide of the Confederacy. Because he had had a lot of victories by this point over the North. He had fought 4 different Union generals, all in commands of Union armies, and defeated them in a series of battles. He had incredible confidence in his men. So he believes that he can take the war to the North, and if he can show the North the horrors of war, if he can defeat a Union army in the North, and why couldn't he if he believes so strongly in his men, then those people in the North, and there were quite a few who wanted to see the war end, would rally around that point. There's a disaffection in the North. There was always some disaffection in the North, but this is 1863. In March of 1863, there was a draft riot in New York. Went on for several days. People died in the riots. One of the political parties, at least a large portion of them, want to see the war end. So Lee's going to see if he can help them out by invading the North. Now, it's typically called an invasion. He wasn't planning on staying. So I think it's probably a grand raid more than it was an invasion, but typically it's called an invasion. So the map that you see there is of northern Virginia. All that yellow area is Virginia, and he is planning on going into Pennsylvania. He seems to be aiming at Harrisburg, which is the capital of Pennsylvania, and he does a wonderful job of hiding his army for a while. If you've ever been to northern Virginia, there's a valley there called the Shenandoah Valley. And the Shenandoah Valley is a natural highway into the heart of Pennsylvania. It runs north-south, but also in an easterly direction. The mountains in between are high enough that if you get over into the Shenandoah Valley, the Union Army can't see you. So he's going to use it as a highway, but also those mountains as a block so that the Union Army won't know where he is. Now, he had just won a victory at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Some people call it his greatest victory. However, it was also something of a defeat. Does anybody know why it was a defeat? What happened at Chancellorsville?
Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson was wounded and then died later. Weakened by his wounds, he caught pneumonia and died. And Stonewall Jackson was definitely Lee's strong right hand. Lee missed him so badly that he reorganized his army around the missing Jackson. What I mean by that is at Chancellorsville, the army was in 2 parts. There was 2 wings to the party, or to the army. But now he doesn't have enough confidence in the generals that remain to keep it in that kind of shape. So he reorganizes his army into 3 corps. And one of the corps is run by James Longstreet. James Longstreet, sometimes called the old war horse. If Jackson was the flashy one, if he was the one you went to for a daring maneuver, Longstreet was the one that you said, don't let them pass. Stay here. And that's what Longstreet will do for you. He's very steady, very good on the defensive. He had already been in charge of one of the wings, so now he's in charge of a corps. But the other 2 corps commanders are new to Corps Command, and they're not going to do so well at Gettysburg. The first was a man who had fought alongside Jackson, or was a subordinate of Jackson, and his name was Ewell, and he Old Baldy Ewell, and he was eccentric like Jackson. Jackson was a very eccentric guy. So was Ewell, and kind of absent-minded. He was recently married, and he would refer to his wife as Mrs. Brown. She had been a widow, and he'd still say Mrs. Brown to her. So, but he had been a very good divisional commander under Jackson, so the expectations are good for him. He actually won't meet those expectations. Then the other Corps commander was a man named A.P. Hill. And A.P. Hill was a divisional commander who had been brilliant. Lee really admired A.P. Hill. In fact, Robert E. Lee's last words on this earth were, "Up comes Hill." Because Hill had, at the Battle of Antietam, at exactly the right moment, Hill had shown up and basically saved the day for Lee. So when he was dying, he apparently saw Hill there, coming to save him one more time. So great expectations for Hill, and in this battle, again, they won't be met. That was the Confederate side of things. For the Union, poor old Lincoln is still looking for a general who can win. He had had great hopes for a general named Hooker, who led at Chancellorsville. After Chancellorsville, he doesn't have any confidence in Hooker, so he replaces him on June 28th. When did the Battle of Gettysburg start? Anybody? July 1st. So George Meade is only in charge a couple of days before he's going to have to fight what ends up being the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. So he's been with the Army, but he hasn't been the commander. By the way, he wasn't Lincoln's first choice. Lincoln will offer the job to another general, who we'll see in a moment. But then he turns to Meade. Again, Lee believes that a second invasion of the North will be more successful than Antietam. Antietam was in Maryland. It had not gone the way Lee had expected it to go. So now he's in Pennsylvania. He thinks things will be better. And he does want to fight a battle. This is not just about a raid where you steal things. He wants to fight a battle, and he's in the North now, so he's looking to do that. Why Gettysburg? The first thing that I would point out is it's a crossroads town. There are 12 roads going into Gettysburg. So if you're wandering around in south central Pennsylvania, they take you there. Those roads are going to take you to that place. By that time, one portion of the Confederate Army had already passed through Gettysburg. The Union Army, which under Meade is beginning to look for the Confederate Army, taking roads that are going to take them at least through Gettysburg. So one of the reasons Gettysburg is simply because it's a crossroads town. Now there's another reason, and that reason has passed into legend, and there are some people who don't believe it, and that is shoes. The Confederate Army, those ragtag guys, had run out of shoes. A lot of their men were barefoot. And the story goes that there was a division somewhat west of Gettysburg, that a Confederate division, that heard a rumor that there were shoes, a shoe factory or a warehouse full of shoes in Gettysburg. And the general of the division asked his commander, who was A.P. Hill, if he could go into Gettysburg and get those damn shoes. And A.P. Hill said, sure, go ahead and try that. Now, I said just recently, historians have kind of disputed that story, and they point out the fact there is no factory in Gettysburg. There is no shoe factory. There's no warehouse that normally stored shoes. So it couldn't possibly be because of that this general went into Gettysburg. They think he made that up as an excuse after the war. Well, this general, whose name was Heath, Heath might have heard a rumor. Just because they weren't there doesn't mean that he didn't think they were there. And the South was desperate for shoes. Just one example, northeast of Gettysburg, a Confederate unit had fought a skirmish with some Pennsylvania militiamen and captured the militiamen. They pardoned them. They said, you can go home, just don't fight us anymore. They used to do that all the time in the Civil War. They couldn't keep them prisoners, so they said, just go home. And they sent them home with a guard. These guys are walking down a road. Another Confederate unit comes up, look over these militiamen and say, take off your shoes. And the militiamen said, how cruel, how can you do this? War is horrible. And they said, look, you're going home. We need the shoes. So there was a real need for shoes. And if you heard that rumor, it seems reasonable that they would have tried to go into Gettysburg and find those shoes. Why would he, the other part of that is, why would he have made up an excuse and said there were shoes when there were not shoes? The thinking behind that is the South loses. So this Confederate general who sent his troops in shouldn't have sent his troops in. So he was looking for an excuse for why he did that. Now he actually, he sent his men into or towards Gettysburg from the west. He sends a reconnaissance, a large group of men, actually two brigades, down this road towards Gettysburg. And it was a reconnaissance. He asked A.P. Hill if he could do that, and A.P. Hill said, okay. The expectation was that all they were going to run into were some militia, some men from Gettysburg and those areas who might take a couple of shots then run off. What the South did not know, and we'll get to why they don't know it in a moment, was that Union cavalry had entered Gettysburg. And when they entered Gettysburg, the general in charge, and his name was Buford, Buford looked around and he kind of recognized this is a good place to fight a defensive battle. Gettysburg is surrounded by ridges. And I've got a couple other maps you'll see in a moment that show the ridges. And he looked at this ground and he said, if we can hold this ground until our army comes up, we can stand on top of this hill and fight off the rebels. So he rides west and meets the Confederate forces coming down that road. Now, why didn't the Confederates know who this guy was? Why did they think it was only militia? Because the Confederate cavalry had failed. The Confederate cavalry up to this time in the war was considered by far better than the Union cavalry. And the general, their job was to screen the army so that the North wouldn't know where the army was, and also to scout and find out where the Union army was. But their commander, a general by the name of Jeb Stuart, was a young man who was a cavalier. He liked the flash and the dash of being a cavalryman. And once, earlier in the war, he had taken his force and ridden completely around the Union Army. Very embarrassing for the Union Army. Well, he decided to do it again. But he did it at the wrong time. He did it when what General Lee needed were eyes. He doesn't need an exploit. He needs somebody who's telling him where the Union Army is, so that in case Lee did not want to fight at Gettysburg, he could avoid them. Instead, the South doesn't have their eyes because Stuart's out riding around the Union Army, playing cavalier, and when Heath's men move down that road and they clash with the Union cavalry, they don't know what it is at first. And that's why the battle is called a meeting engagement. It was not expected. It was kind of, well, here we are. The orders had been for if he hit a strong force, to disengage. But again, because he decided that no, these are either militiamen or cavalry. Now, the men in the front, the Confederate soldiers in the front who were fighting these guys said, no, they are real soldiers. But A.P. Hill dismisses that idea. It's a huge mistake. Now, A.P. Hill might have been, was ill at the time, so his judgment was probably clouded. What happened? General Buford, again, recognizing that this was good ground to fight on, decided to delay the Confederate Army. Cavalry can't fight infantry, not for long. But what he can do is delay the infantry, the Confederate infantry, long enough that the main Union Army can march up and seize the best ground. The ovals you see there are ridges. And so he is going to slowly give way, but take a position on the next ridge. You always want the high ground. You can shoot down on the enemy. And so he will slowly give way on these ridges, forcing the infantry to completely deploy so that they are in this big grand formation where they have to attack. That takes a long time. Because it takes a long time, he's buying time for the Union Army, which is down here. And they're marching up as quickly as they can. This is a hand-drawn map that came from a Union signalman who was describing when the first Union infantry showed up. This is the battle for McPherson's Ridge. The Confederates are lined up. There's a creek in front of McPherson's Ridge, and the Confederates are going to march over that creek and take the ridge. The Union cavalry fights them for a while, long enough to have an infantry division show up. The division that shows up is actually the whole wing that shows up, or corps that shows up, is commanded by a general named Reynolds. Remember when I mentioned that before Meade was offered the command of the Army of the Potomac, someone else was? Well, Reynolds was offered the command. Lincoln thought very highly of him, but he had turned him down. So now, instead of being at the Army headquarters, he's on the front lines. Reynolds shows up, and again, it's a little bit hard to see, but these are woods here. Here's that creek I mentioned. This is McPherson's Ridge. And two brigades of Confederates, one commanded by a general named Archer, another by a man named Davis, who was the nephew of Jefferson Davis. They're off to the north. But this group is going to sneak through the woods. They're going to go through the woods, and by going through the woods, they can get around what they believe are only cavalry now. Reynolds had ridden up into the woods, showing a brigade where to go, and he was shot. If you go to the battlefield at Gettysburg, that's one of the first stops you make, where Reynolds was shot, and he died almost instantly. He was shot in the woods. The next group that comes in is what a brigade known as the Iron Brigade. Some of these divisions and brigades in the Civil War become famous because of their fighting ability. On the northern side, there's the Iron Brigade, a bunch of Westerners, people from Wisconsin and Indiana who show up, well, that's what they were called back then. That was the West. Farm boys, at least, big strapping farm boys, they show up in the Army of the Potomac, and they establish early on that they are really strong fighters. In fact, they get their reputation at the Second Battle of Bull Run. So when we get there, I'll tell you how they got that reputation. They're one of my favorite groups. I really admire these guys. And they show up here just in time. They ran the last bit, knocking over fences. They didn't use roads because they knew that it was that close run thing, that the Confederates are coming, we better get here. So they charge up, and if you look at the line, they extended past the Confederate line. That's a good thing if you're on the attack. If you can extend past the enemy, then you can hit them in the flank. They can't shoot you. They're pointed another direction. So the Iron Brigade comes up, and they attack, and they break Archer's brigade. They fall back over this stream. In fact, the Iron Brigade went too far. They crossed the stream as well so that they were not in a good defensive position. And one of the regimental commanders said, "Get back over here, what are you doing?" Because everything was threatened because they were doing so well in the fight. They captured Archer, the Confederate commander in charge of this brigade that they've broken up. They actually captured him. He was the first Confederate general captured since Lee had gotten command of the Army of Northern Virginia. That's the Iron Brigade coming in, capturing Archer. When he was marched back to the Union lines, Archer ran into a Union general who was a friend of his from before the war, because Archer had been in the war. It was a man named Abner Doubleday. Doubleday's famous for what? For not inventing baseball. He didn't invent it, but everybody says he did. But anyway, Doubleday sees Archer, and he says, "Good morning, Archer. How are you? I am glad to see you." And Archer replies, "Well, I am not glad to see you by a damn sight." So he was not happy at all. The Iron Brigade were famous also for their black hats. They had a very stylish hat that one of their generals had given to them. But I found a story just last night about the Iron Brigade I want to share. When they first came into the Army, the suppliers to the Union armies were more concerned with profit than with their product. And the one that was producing uniforms produced some uniforms that just literally fell apart after a short period of time. And before the Iron Brigade had even been in battle, their uniforms were so ragged that their underwear showed through. And at a review where there's a general riding by in a buggy, he brought his daughter to see the review, and she's looking at this, and he pulled his buggy behind the unit so that the unit could parade by all these civilians. And the little girl looked at her father and said, "Daddy, shouldn't we pull the carriage in front of the unit?" So the Iron Brigade stops the Confederate advance. But remember, there were two brigades of Confederates moving towards Gettysburg. There was Archer's group, but then there was Davis's group up north. So let's take a look up at that. The Union had a group called, another brigade besides the Iron Brigade, called Cutler's Brigade. They move up to a clearing. This was all in the woods. This is a clearing. This is a farm, McPherson's farm, right on top of the ridge. The Confederates move around the stream and are coming over an open field towards Cutler's Brigade. And they, by the way, cut up several of them. They defeat the Union forces. It looked pretty bad for the Union at this point, but there's still some Iron Brigade men out there. The reserve, a regiment, 6th Wisconsin, was the reserve, and they're rushed over to Cutler's group because Cutler's group is in trouble. The Confederates move forward. Things are looking good for them, but there is, see where it says railroad cut? The railroad was unfinished, but they had dug through the ridge so that it's a nice level track for the railroad. So they had just dug through the ridge, calling it a cut, and the Confederates come across this thing and they go down into it. It's 15 feet high at the top, 15 feet high, so that once you're down in there, you can't see anything. And now it tapers off because the ridge is not wide, and if you're on either end, it's a nice trench, but for the majority of Davis's brigade, they can't see anyone. And Cutler and the 6th Wisconsin charged that railway cut over, by the way, the open ground, and they capture these guys. If you look here, you can kind of see it. See how high it is? All those men were just standing around. One guy said, I climbed to the top. It took me quite a while. When I got to the top, I fired once. It's a musket. And then I tumbled back down. I was there last summer, and I wanted to see. So I walked through there, and I tried to climb up it. Now, I don't remember what I was wearing, but I couldn't do it. So, yeah, they were just standing around, and they ended up having to surrender to the Iron Brigade and the men from Cutler's brigade as well. But the Iron Brigade, again, clothed itself in glory on the first day of Gettysburg. In fact, they were, after this particular portion of the battle, which is about 10 o'clock in the morning, things seem to kind of slow down. There's a lull. But the only reason there's a lull is Confederates are rushing to the battle now. Orders have gone out, bring these guys to this field. And the Union trying to get more men up. So now we're going to look at some stories of bravery. I call them human interest stories. On the first day, McPherson's Ridge, we were just talking about that with the Iron Brigade. John L. Burns. John L. Burns was not in the Army. He was a civilian who was in his 70s, who, by God, was going to fight. If the Confederates are here, he's going to fight. So he grabbed his old flintlock and runs out to McPherson's Ridge. Now, somewhere he came across a wounded soldier, or one officer said they gave him a modern rifle, and he said, I'm going to fight. So they gave him to the Iron Brigade and said, well, you can fight with them. And he fought for a few hours. He shot, he swears he killed 3. And he was wounded, laid on the field for 4 days. That's not true. He laid on, the Confederates found him wounded, and he lied and said, well, I was out just looking for some stray cows that had wandered off, and I got hit. So then they let him go. That's what happened. Now, this became a big deal, especially after the North won the battle, that even someone like Burns would go out there and fight. And so he became something of a minor celebrity, and he was the first guide of the Gettysburg battlefield. Now, that was before there was a national park or anything. People would come to Gettysburg to see about the fight, and he would be the one that would lead them until a few years after the battle, where he became spooked because of a spook. He was out there leading a tour, and he said he saw a ghost of one of the men he had killed. And he never went back on the battlefield. So, Gettysburg is supposed to be one of the most haunted places around. So, all right, so that's John L. Burns. The Iron Brigade, I mentioned to you, there is one line I want you to see from the Iron Brigade. There's Abner Doubleday, who took control of the Union forces there that morning when Reynolds was killed. And Doubleday is looking at the pressure from the Confederates, and he goes up to some members of the Iron Brigade, and he says, "You must hold this ridge." And these are guys from the Iron Brigade, they replied back to him, "If we can't hold it, where will you find men who can?" They were infinitely, they believed in themselves. Okay. But it is a high cost. This man in the 7th Wisconsin, one of those charging through the woods, was shot in the side of the head, and it went through his head and blinded him. He received the Medal of Honor. I couldn't find anywhere what he did other than get shot. But he did receive the Medal of Honor. And as you can see, he had to wear the glass. The cost was high. They lost lots and lots of men there. And that's at McPherson's Ridge. But the day is young yet. That's only one portion of the battlefield. You have A.P. Hill's men pushing in, but now they've sent out orders to the rest of the Confederate Army to come in and help. So another corps, the Corps of Ewell, is rushing to Gettysburg, and they're coming in from the north because they had already passed Gettysburg. They had been heading towards Harrisburg, so they come in from the north, and what we have is fighting at a place called Oak Hill. It's one of the highest points of the battlefield. If you go there, even from Little Round Top, which is on the other end of the battlefield, you can see there's a monument there, the Eternal Peace Monument, by the way, that is on top of Oak Hill. Some of A.P. Hill's troops take the hill, and then they look at coming down the ridge, hitting on McPherson's Ridge, and taking the Iron Brigade and Cutler's Brigade in flank. You always want to do that. The only thing better than that is taking them from behind. So, because they can't turn around and shoot you fast enough, you're going to get a chance to shoot them. So they are really excited about getting to walk across this big open field. That's where they fought most of the battles, and strike the Union Army in the flank. Again, talking about ghosts, here's the most haunted spot on the battlefield by most accounts. There was a Confederate general by the name of Iverson, not a very good general, who was in command of a brigade that was told, "Get in line," and they got in line beautifully. Now march across that open field and see way over there, those are some Yankees. Strike them in the flank. What they didn't know was that other Union troops had moved up, and as Iverson's men march out into this open field, and they're looking this way, there's an entire brigade, more than a brigade, of Union troops behind a stone wall pointing at them. They're out in an open field. They march out, and when they get far enough out, the Union troops stand up from behind the wall and mow them down. A perfect line. That's how it's always described when you read about the Battle of Gettysburg. They fell in perfect formation. In fact, Iverson, who didn't, by the way, lead from the front, most Civil War generals did, or at least were there somewhere. He stayed back on Oak Hill. He looks out, and he became angry with his men because it just looked like they laid down, like they were scared and wouldn't go out and fight. And instead, they were just mowed down. So if you go there to this day, it's called the Iverson Pits, because they just went out after the battle and just dug holes there. And because the Union held the field, Union doesn't care about Confederate bodies. So they just dumped them there. Now, many of them were reinterred in the South later, but there were many that they never found, so they say they're still out there. Okay, the 11th Pennsylvania. It's kind of a happy story. This is one of my personal favorites. The 11th Pennsylvania was one of those units behind that stone wall. And they fought for most of the morning, but at some point they're going to get pushed back because the Confederates are going to win the first day. It's like winning the first quarter. They're going to win the first day, and the Union is going to, troops are going to have to retreat. In retreating, they left behind many wounded and dead from the 11th Pennsylvania. If you go there, you will see their monument. The 11th Pennsylvania Regiment's mascot was a bull terrier named Sally. Now, I've heard that she was wounded. I don't think I say that here, but she certainly loved those men. And when those men fell and the rest left, she wandered out onto the battlefield to where her dead masters lay. And she lay down among the dead, and she stayed there for 4 days, never getting up, getting water or anything. She stayed there because she was going to be with her masters. The 11th, the men who survived, came back after the battle, and they found her there. And so years later, the veterans, when they're thinking of the war, one of the things that they wanted to do was honor Sally because she had shown such loyalty in a situation like that. I like the fact they said she hated rebels, Democrats, and women. So, did I say? The sad part is she didn't survive the war. She had a tendency to charge the enemy. So she really didn't like rebels. And a year later, in fighting in Northern Virginia, she was shot. So she's the only animal that supposedly has 2 monuments on Civil War battlefields, because she has a monument where she was killed as well. But I do like that story because I like animals. Okay, so that's Oak Hill. At this point, the Confederacy is pressuring the Union on the first day, but it's by no means certain that the Confederates are going to win. But now they have another division come in, and it comes in from the east, where it's not expected, from the northeast. And the Union is kind of getting spread thin here because they're putting their men over on this side, and now there's a force coming over from the right. So they sent a group over to this. If you go there, it's just a slight rise. They call it a knoll, but it's a bald rise. And they send some troops over to take that area. It is now called Barlow's Knoll, after a Union general who was wounded there. The Confederates come in pretty strong force, and they strike hard there, and Barlow, the general, can't hold that area. Now, in the process, a large portion of this corps, which is what's going to crumble, all the men over on that side, it was the 11th Corps. And there were many of these men who were German, who had come over. Their commands came in German, who had come over, migrated to America. And in the Battle of Chancellorsville, just a few months before, they had cut and run at the pivot. Now, they were hitting the flank. So rather than die, they ran, and now they run again. So because they're German and because they ran, they get a very bad nickname, the Flying Dutchman. And in other battles, they fought quite well, but that's going to stick with them, the Flying Dutchman. When they begin to crumble, when they begin to run, one group, one regiment from Maine, sees that they're going to be captured. They're being surrounded. They're being pressured from 2 sides. And they knew they were going to have to surrender. They took their regimental flag and tore it into little pieces and hid it, with each man taking a piece of the flag, so that the flag would not fall to the enemy. because regimental flags were important. That was where your honor was, and so men would fight over these flags. And over and over again, you hear these stories. 4 and 5 guys, the banner holders would fall, and somebody else would run over and pick it up. And see, I would want to be away from the flag, but that was the place of honor. You wanted to hold that flag up. So these guys just tore the flag into little pieces, and they said, years after the battle, families were very proud of their little swatch of the regimental flag. So because of the fighting on Barlow's Knoll, and we'll get to some of the things that happened there in one moment, but I want you to know that kind of is what kicks in the Union retreat. Some people call it a retreat, others will call it a rout, because there was some running. People are going to run past Gettysburg. They're going to run through Gettysburg. There's going to be fighting in Gettysburg because of that. So let's look at some human interest stories in Barlow's Knoll. Gordon and Barlow. Barlow himself, the Union general. This story was featured after the war, because at some point, 1870s and 1880s, after tempers had cooled, we were looking to reconcile the two sides. And so we looked for stories that showed our commonality as opposed to our differences. And one of those stories was that about Barlow, because Barlow was wounded, severely wounded. And the story goes that the Confederate general in charge, who was leading his brigade that rolled right over Barlow's men, stopped his command, not the soldiers, but his own participation in the battle, to go over and to help Barlow. Called over a Confederate surgeon who looked at Barlow and said, he's not going to live. But Gordon said, no, take him back to the hospital. They took Barlow back. This part is true. They took Barlow back to the hospital. Confederate surgeons looked at him and said, nope, he's not going to live. His wife, Barlow's wife, was a nurse who was helping the wounded. And Gordon sent for Barlow's wife. Let his wife come through the line so that she can be with her husband at the end. She kept him alive. None of the Confederate surgeons are taking care of him. She keeps him alive. Later, when the Union wins the battle, he's sent back because he's going to die anyway. And Union surgeons look at him and say, yeah, he's dead. And she nursed him back to life so that 6 months later he was back in command. Supposedly, years later, both these, Gordon and Barlow, were both in Congress, and they met each other, and they were both surprised to meet the other because they thought both had died. The problem is that Barlow later denied that he ever met Gordon. So it's just a good story. But if you go to Gettysburg, you'll hear that story. That's one. Now, but he was wounded, and his wife certainly deserves all the credit because she just wouldn't let him die. Schimmelpfennig. I just love the name Schimmelpfennig. Schimmelpfennig was in charge of a brigade that collapsed. He's a German. Now, Schimmelpfennig, by the way, got his job because of his name. Because at the beginning of the war, when Lincoln was looking to solidify his support among Germans, these ethnic Germans who came over, he was going through a list with one of his secretaries. And they went down, Schultz, and I'm trying to think of other ones, can't think of any other S's, but they got to Schimmelpfennig, and then the secretary said Schimmelpfennig, then they went on and they talked about other, and Lincoln, whoa, go back 2 or 3. And they said, what, Schimmelpfennig? And Lincoln said, he'll do. And the guy said, well, I don't know that he would be a good general. And Lincoln said, that name will do. So that's how he was important politically, but that's how he got the job. Well, he crumbles. When they're running through Gettysburg, it became chaotic. There were streets that were blocked, and the Confederates were right behind them. So Schimmelpfennig, better part of valor, ran into a backyard and hid either in a culvert or in a pigsty. We're not sure which. Either way, he was there for 4 days. And they found him later on when the Union came back into the town. That's where he hid, underneath. And there's a plaque that says that's where he hid. So the whole town is like that. Everything is historical. All right, the next one is the story of Wilkerson. And this is sad. This is not a good story. Wilkerson was an officer. He was only 19 years old. He commanded a artillery unit, and he was wounded and died. What you see there is the beginning of a report, a newspaper report, of the Battle of Gettysburg. But if you read this, it says, details from our special correspondent. Who can write the history of a battle whose eyes are immovably fastened upon a central figure of transcendingly absorbing interest, the dead body of an oldest born, crushed by a shell in a position where a battery could never have been sent, and abandoned to death in a building where surgeons dared not stay. His father was the correspondent who came across this abandoned hospital and saw his son there. Can you imagine? That's why he says, how can you write the history of the battle? What I have seen is my own son. So, a couple things about the town, some stories about the town, because again, there was fighting in the town itself, and then for the next 2 days, there was always someone shooting into the town and shooting out of the town, even though the town itself was no longer part of the major maneuvers. There were people fighting, shooting in the town. The lines came right at the border of town. So I want to tell you a few of the stories because I do think they're interesting or fun. The horse story. The horse story is as Union troops are pouring through town south trying to get to the high ground. An officer is blocked. He can't get through the street because of all the people in the street. So he rode his horse up on a porch trying to get by. There's people on the porch. So he rode up to the front door and kicked the front door in and rode his horse into the front room of this house and into the dining room where a family was having dinner. And he said, "Is there any back way out of the house?" And a young girl gets up, opens the back door, and says, "Well, you can go that way." And he rode out. Now, supposedly, she ran out and was going to knock down the fence for him, but he said, "No, go back in where it's safe." And he took his horse and he leaped over the fence and he ended up escaping. Window story. Civilians were stuck in Gettysburg. If they didn't get out before the battle, because there were people shooting, you couldn't really travel the streets. So you were stuck in Gettysburg, and most of them went down into their basements and just hid. Well, one gentleman got tired by the second day of just sitting down there and not knowing what was going on. So he gets up, leaves the basement, goes up to the second floor of his home and opens up a shutter and looks out. And as he did it, he thought, this may not be the smartest thing I've ever done. So he stepped back and he said, about that time the window exploded and his bedstead just splintered because someone was taking a shot at him. He just barely missed being killed. The premonition. Soldiers often have premonitions of their coming death. There was a case of a Union soldier who had always shown great bravery in battles. But before Gettysburg even started, he had become shaken. He knew, or he told people, "I'm not going to make it." He's in this unit that is very close to the town. Just outside of town is a hill called, it was a cemetery, was on top of the hill. And he's on the hill, and there are some snipers that can from the town, shoot directly into his position. So his officer asked for volunteers, and everyone volunteered essentially except him. And he went to him and said, I really want you because, you're so good. You're such a great soldier. And he said, I just don't want to do it. I know I'm not going to come back. And the officer said, you're going. So they go into town. They take the house, and then they go back to their position on the hill. And they say and the soldier's with them, he comes up, and they say he was just white as a sheet. He was so shaken. So one of his buddies said, just lay down on the ground. You'll be fine. And when he laid down, it was just then that an artillery shell exploded above him and killed him. Happy story. The raid. There were many of these raids into town from the Union positions because they're on a hill, and yes, there's some gravestones there and some walls, but the Confederates have buildings that they're firing from. So there was one particular house that just seemed to be crammed full of snipers. They really wanted to do something to stop the snipers, so a guy got volunteers, and he got 5 men. He said, I want you to go take this building when I say charge. So the 5 men get ready, charge. Only one man leaps up. He runs across the open field, gets on the porch, takes the butt of his gun and begins to slam it against the door, screaming, surrender. And all the rebels came out and surrendered, not realizing that only one guy was out there. So he took his prisoners back to the line. The story of the boy. As I told you, there's shooting throughout the 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg. There's nothing you can do about that. You can't go out on the streets. It'll get you killed. But Union soldiers noticed that there was a young boy running through the streets, throwing rocks through windows. He's busting any window that's not getting busted by bullets. And laughing, he is having the best time. It's chaos. He's having the best time. They said when a bullet went near him, you could see him duck, and then he'd just jump up and laugh. That was so funny. And he's never hurt. Some citizens asked the Confederates, who's that kid? And the Confederates replied, he's the devil that's come up from the south with us. Nobody knows who the child was. So I like that story. I mean, that's youth for you. Enderlin was a man on that hill who, after the first day, some of the guys didn't make it to the hill. They lay out in the field, dying or dead. And one of them was a friend of his who's calling out and is obviously in a lot of pain. And Enderlin finally couldn't take it, and he told his officer, I need to go out there and get him. The officer refused until dark, and when it became dark, Enderlin said, I'm going out there. And he took off all of his, or most of his clothes, so that he could crawl through the field easily. He made it to the man and drug him back to close to the lines, and then stood up, picked him up, and ran the last distance with the Confederates shooting at him. Now, the story doesn't have a happy ending. The man passed away anyway. But in honor of President's Day, the man who died was the great-grandfather of Richard Nixon. So, angels. Not everybody's a hero. Not everybody's like Enderlin. Sometimes you have people who are very frightened. And one Union soldier was kind of known for not really doing his bit. And as some Union soldiers at Cemetery Hill are laying behind the stone wall, every once in a while they'll get up and they'll shoot, and then they'll lie back down. Well, the officer who knew this, who was in charge of this particular guy, had 2 soldiers laying beside him. so that he wouldn't run off. And they kind of prodded him. You know, you need to fight too. You need to be part of this. So fire your weapon. So he did, straight up in the air. And somebody said, you ain't going to hit any Rebs up there, you're just going to kill angels. So hopefully he started shooting where he's supposed to shoot. And then two very famous stories about the locals in Gettysburg. You'll see in a moment that one of the prominent features south of the town was a place called Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill was a commanding hill. If you could get that, you could control the whole battlefield. You could put artillery up there. In the Confederate Army was a man named Wesley Culp. And Wesley Culp had been from Gettysburg. But his job had taken him to Virginia. And while in Virginia, he joined the militia. This is before the war, of course. And then he had ties with Virginia. And when the war started, he joined the Confederate Army. On the night of July 2nd, the second day of the battle, he was on the skirmish line at Culp's Hill, his family's property, when a Union bullet found him and killed him. So he had traveled to Virginia and then back home to die. And then the only civilian to die at Gettysburg, Jenny, her home was in the middle of Gettysburg. If she'd stayed in her home, she probably would have been okay. But her sister, who lived on the southern part of town, had just had a baby, so Jenny and her mother went to stay in the little house where her sister lived to take care of the baby. And they had stayed hidden for 2 days, but after that, they needed some food, so Jenny went upstairs to bake bread. And while she was in the kitchen, a bullet crashed through the front door, passed through a second door, the door to the kitchen, and struck her in the back. And she fell dead. She died not knowing that her fiancé, who was in the Union Army, had died a few weeks before at another battle. So there's a museum for Jenny. As you can see from the dotted arrows, the Union Army has been pushed back through Gettysburg, but they've got the exact place they wanted. They are on the high ground. All those little stories I just told you about the cemetery, this is Cemetery Hill right here, just outside of town. This is all high ground. Here's Culp's Hill there. Now, if you notice, there's no blue dots on Culp's Hill. One of the things that people, Southern patriots, complain about is that old Baldy Ewell was instructed by Lee to take Culp's Hill at the end of the day. The Confederates are winning this whole battle, and Lee sends an order to Ewell saying, if practicable, take Culp's Hill, take that high eminence. And Baldy Ewell complained, not to Lee, but to some of his subordinates. What does that mean, if practicable? He was used to working with Stonewall Jackson, who didn't say if practical. He'd say, take the damn hill. Well, not damn, but he'd say, take the hill. So he does, wait, it's up to my discretion. And so he chooses not to take the hill. Had he taken the hill, again, it's this tall eminence there. You can see the battlefield. They control the high ground. They could have pushed the Union off the rest of the ground. So a huge mistake. Most of the rest of the Union Army is going to arrive and be set up on that ridge, which is called Cemetery Ridge. And Lee, being congratulated, by the way, by his men and officers, saying we've won another great victory, thinks one more push and it's over. We'll beat the Union, and it's on northern ground. So what he's going to do, he has one corps that hasn't even fought yet, Longstreet's corps, his solid, the old war horse. His men haven't even been in the fight yet. So they show up, and he decides to attack the left flank of the Union Army. The the Union line, they always refer to it in the same way, the fish hook. It's a fish hook. Over here is Culp's Hill. Here's Cemetery Hill. And then this is all Cemetery Ridge. This ridge, Lee decides to attack here because there are two large hills that if he can take them, he will command the battlefield. One is called Little Round Top, the other Round Top. Very tall, and at the time they had been cut clean because that's what they were used for, a woodlot, the farmer who had them. So if you can take that, Lee's thought is he can set up artillery, he can control the battlefield, and possibly even bag the entire Union Army, because if there's a disadvantage to this, and there's very few disadvantages for the Union Army on this, there's a road that runs just like this up to Gettysburg. If you take this area and you have the high ground, you can also take that road. And every Union soldier up here is essentially surrounded then. So you might be able to capture the Union Army. But at the very least, you're going to be able to command all of this area. So that's what Lee wants to do on the second day. He orders Longstreet, the warhorse, to do that. Longstreet does not like those orders. One of the great controversies of the Battle of Gettysburg is the fact that Longstreet says, well, we shouldn't do that. Let's have the Yankees attack us, because the rebel forces had their own ridge, Seminary Ridge. So instead of us going uphill, force the Union to cross this open space, most of it was open, and have them attack us. Or if you you really want to do this thing, instead of attacking here, this is Little Round Top. There was the big hill is Big Round Top. He said, let's go around and cut them off and force them to come to us. Lee says, they're there, the enemy is there, or those men. He usually referred to those people, that's right. Those people are there, so we will strike them there. Southerners did not like Longstreet because even though he was this very good general, after the war, he became a scallywag. He became a Southerner who worked with the North. And you just don't do that. And so he got blamed for everything. And by the way, he did some things wrong that he should have been blamed for, but it was like, just dump everything on him. Lee's great. Lee didn't make a mistake by attacking. It's all Longstreet's fault. Longstreet has a pretty good excuse for the reason it took him so long to strike. But he certainly did not want to attack. So he is going to attack this area right here, Little Round Top. He's going to send the Hood's division, which is a division that includes the Texas Brigade, a very famous group of fighters, and they are going to cross a valley and then go up a hill to fight the Union forces. To get there, though, at this location, I don't know how many yards it was, there is something called Devil's Den. It is a series of giant rocks and boulders that command this whole area. And it looks more like something should be in the Rocky Mountains than in the hills of Pennsylvania. And Hood's men have to go right through that. So, and there are Union troops there, and we're going to get to why those Union troops are there in a moment. But Hood sends his division across. They strike Devil's Den, and there is a horrible fight at Devil's Den. The Texas men get in, and it's just a jumble. It's a maze. If you ever go there, it's just a crazy place that you would try to fight a battle in. There's a story of a man let's see if I can remember it without Willis Barbie. Willis Barbie from Texas joined the Confederate Army in Galveston, but we don't know where he's from. I mean, I guess from the Gulf Coast somewhere, but we're not sure of where in Texas, but he did join the Confederate Army in Galveston. He was a courier for General Hood. He doesn't have to fight, but in every battle, after he's carried whatever messages Hood wants to carry, he'll ride his horse to where his old troopers are, and he jumps off and he starts fighting because he likes to kill Yankees. And on this day, he rides up to Devil's Den, and his horse is shot down from under him. And again, every account you read, they say the same thing. He hit the ground running. He just leaps, I mean, it's like a Hollywood movie. He leaps off his horse and runs over to Devil's Den, where he climbs up on one of these huge rocks. And he's shooting down at the Union forces 24, 25 times. People are handing him rifles so that he can take a shot. He's hit in the foot, he's shot in the foot, and he falls down. He manages to crawl back up, takes another couple of shots, is shot in the leg, falls down, gets someone to help him, he gets back up, is shooting again, is hit again, and falls down, and then he gets mad. But he got mad because nobody would help him up again. He wanted to keep fighting. For his bravery and for his actions, he received the Confederate Medal of Honor. None of these stories end happily. He died the next year in a battle. Anyway, they took Devil's Den. Now the Confederate forces have to take Little Round Top. So they're crossing. Had they been a little quicker, maybe if they hadn't taken till 4. So this is one of the things that when people point to Longstreet, they had attacked earlier. Little Round Top was empty. There were supposed to be Union troops there, but for some reasons we'll talk about in a moment, they weren't there. So the Confederate forces start up that hill, and Union troops have just arrived. A general had gone up onto this hill, looked around and went, I can see Confederates over there, they're coming here, we got nobody here. And he ran and grabbed a brigade that was back on this road, and he brought them up in the nick of time. A brigade commanded by a man named Strong Vincent, who will die on that hill, commanding the troops. But before he died, Vincent puts his men on the side of this hill, and he takes the 20th Maine, one of the most famous units now from the Army of the Potomac. He takes the 20th Maine, and he puts them at the very end of the line. They are the tail end of the Army of the Potomac. And they're up on the hill, and Strong Vincent's words to the commander is, you have to hold this spot no matter what. If the Confederates take this spot, they'll be able to roll up our flank and take us. So everything is riding on the 20th Maine if the Confederates find them. If you ever go to Gettysburg, where the 20th Maine was, it's all laid out there, and you can see it's a lonely spot. It's in the trees, and it's the end of the line. And the commander, the man in charge, Colonel Chamberlain, Joshua Chamberlain, is going to watch as men from Alabama are crawling up that hill, and he begins to his men begin to fire at them. There's a strong, hard battle that goes on. His line is bent back. He holds them off, but the Confederates won't leave. His men run out of bullets. And Chamberlain said, fixed bayonets. He didn't say charge, he just said fixed bayonets. But the next thing he knew, everybody was running down the hill with their bayonets, attacking the Confederate soldiers, and beat off that attack. And by doing so, saved Little Round Top. That wasn't the last of the fighting on the second day. There was some other places where you could say, well, maybe it was here that the Confederacy had their high water mark. The 1st Minnesota Regiment, just a regiment of men, were kind of guarding a cannon in the middle of the line, and the Confederates had been pushing back the Union so hard that a general rode up and he looked around, and the only men he had left was this one regiment of men. And 4 times their number of Confederates are charging them. And he looked back, and there were some Union troops coming up, but they're at least 5 minutes away. And so he looked at the colonel of the 1st Minnesota, and he said, "Sir, take those colors," meaning the Union, the Confederate colors. Both men knew what that meant. That was a suicide mission. They're outnumbered 4 to 1, and they're going to be charging over open ground. The 1st Minnesota charged. You can't say that they won, but they won. The men dropped left and right. 67% casualties. But they held on long enough that those other Union troops were able to come up. The 1st Minnesota lost more men in combat in a single battle, this battle, than any other unit in the war. So they gave the last full measure, which is, by the way, the name of a book about them. All right, so Lee does not break the Union Army on the second day. So on the third day, he said, well, look, we attacked up here on the first day. On the right, we attacked here on the second day on the left. They've got to be weak here. They just have to be. So we're going to take what men we have left, and there were 2 divisions, and we're going to march them across this 2 miles of open ground, and we're going to attack them where they're weakest, right in the center. 95,000 to 70,000. Those were the numbers. So there are about 20,000 more men that the Union has. And guess where they were? Right there. In reserve, right there. So there's it's called Pickett's Charge. It's very famous. It's considered the high water mark. It was suicide. Lee insisted. They charged across those open fields. There were fences in their ways. They had to stop and crawl over the fences, knock the fences down. You can't charge 2 miles. You walk, and then you trot, and then you start running at the end. And the whole time, Union sharpshooters are firing at you, and artillery is exploding. I cannot imagine that. It is just incredible that they had the willpower to continue to head towards that wall. And finally they did. Some of them reached the wall, reached the line, and crossed the line. For just a moment, they have pierced the Union line. There's a movie called Gettysburg, which I think is way too long a movie. But the scene where they show that, where they pierced the line, and then what happens after that, I think is pretty phenomenal, because they're fighting, and then it's over. It's as if the Confederates lost the will to fight, or there's just not enough of them left, and they surrender. We walked all this way, saw our friends die, and now we surrender. Except for some, the survivors, who begin to go across that valley, and many of them walk backwards. Why? They did not want to be seen as cowards if they were killed. So they walked backwards across that 2 miles, because the Union, they're still firing at them the whole time. For me, the sad thing about Pickett's Charge, besides the death, was it was hopeless from the beginning. There was no one to support them. The plan said that there were going to be cavalry troops that came over way in the back, but there weren't enough cavalry troops. And since these were the last of Lee's fresh troops, had he broken this line, the troops that were over here, they were all worn out anyway. So the chances are Pickett's charge being the high water mark, I think, stretches the point. I think the high water mark for the Confederacy was on the second day on Little Round Top, when they almost broke the 20th Maine. This battle ended on July 3rd. Vicksburg, the fall of Vicksburg, was on July 4th. So two major battles the Union won. And before this time, the Union hadn't beaten Lee. So now they prove that they can beat Lee. And it's essentially over for the South from that point on.